China has really fulfilled all its targets over the past 4 decades and so. And this is because the Chinese people are fully enabled to exercise their own rights. We put a premium on the right to life. The Chinese society will be more inclusive. The Chinese society will emphasize both on individual rights as well as societal rights as a whole.
Welcome aboard a journey through time at the Chat Lounge.
From determining economic and social development strategies to formulating defense budgets and legal framework, China's unique domestic governing system has ensured a steady and fruitful voyage of the nation over the past 75 years. Unlike what's described as a rubber stamp by the Western media, the People's Congress plays a pivotal role in the management of domestic affairs by the Chinese government, which has been found to be the world's most trusted government by Western research institutes, including Harvard. Why the misunderstanding of the Chinese political governance system? How has China's democratic system evolved? And what's behind the resilience of China's domestic governance? Hello and welcome to the Chat Lounge. I'm Tu Yun. In this episode of our special series commemorating 75 years of the People's Republic of China, we talk to Victor Gao, Vice President of the Center for China and Globalization, on the development of China's domestic governance. Thanks for joining me at the Chat Lounge, Victor.
Thank you for having me.
Well, let's begin with your personal experiences. Correct me if I'm wrong. You became Chinese leader Deng Xiaoping's translator at the age of 23, right? In the 1980s.
Indeed, that was the highlight of my career and personal life.
That's a pivotal transition period in the People's Republic's history, and you witnessed many political events. Please name the ones you believe were the most critical in shaping the country's domestic governance.
Well, first of all, I think Deng Xiaoping's personal decision to resume college entrance examination back in 1978 was a very important moment in China's reform and opening to the outside world, enabling people, including me, to enter college. And later, we went on to do different things. Without such reopening of the Chinese universities, another generation of young people may be lost because they would not be able to enter college for their higher education.
Indeed.
Now, when I was an interpreter for Deng Xiaoping in the 1980s, I remember very clearly he always talked about China's opening to the outside world. And the reason of opening to the outside world was not a sense of inferiority. It is actually based on a sense of equilibrium with the other countries in the world. Why? Because China is a country with great culture and civilization, and China needed to learn from other countries and also learn from whichever country which has better ways of doing things. At that time, China just got out of this huge ideological box, splitting the hair between socialism versus capitalism, and Deng Xiaoping's great contribution was to ask the whole country to build socialism with Chinese characteristics, thus enabling the whole country and the whole nation to learn and try their best to do what we consider the Chinese characteristics. Therefore, socialism becomes dynamic and interactive, and whatever we can pick up from other countries, benefit for greater productivity and efficiency, can be folded into socialism with Chinese characteristics. I think this is the key to China's tremendous amount of transformation over the past 45 years or so.
Indeed. Actually, going back a little bit to 1954, there's another pivotal political event that would be decisive to the country's whole political system or its governance. It's the establishment of the People's Congress system as it's the country's fundamental political system, right? But there have been long been voices, especially in the West, questioning such a system, saying it's just a rubber stamp and there is no democracy in China. So how accurate is such an assessment?
Well, first of all, there are many false accusations about the realities in China, sometimes based on ignorance, sometimes based on lack of real curiosity about what China is really all about, sometimes based on misconceptions or pure prejudice against China. In China, we consider the People's Congress as the highest body of state power, meaning the National Congress is the highest body of state power, and it's responsible for many important things, including legislation for the whole country. And in China, we call the democratic system as democracy with Chinese characteristics, meaning democracy is always important. China is based upon the ideals and the ambitions and the aspirations for democracy. On the other hand, democracy needs to be tailor-made to suit the national circumstances in China. And in that sense, every country is different. China is different from the United States, different from Japan, for example, or many countries in the developing world. And each country needs to come up with its own special way to promote its own democracy. If, for example, certain countries follow blindly stereotype of democracy, they may not solve the problems facing their nation or lifting their people out of poverty. Now, based on this rationale, I think the huge transformation of China for its political system as well as its economy over the past 4 decades and more is achieved because China's democracy works. And China's democracy is suited to the national circumstances we are faced with in China. And the Chinese democracy with Chinese characteristics are definitely not identical to democracies or their political system in other countries. Whatever works in China works for China, and it may or may not work for any other country. Any other country need to figure out what's the best roadmap to achieve their own democracy with their own national characteristics.
Then how would you define as Chinese characteristics, the Chinese style democracy? Now we call it whole process people's democracy. So how is it different from the Western style democracy then? And this kind of democracy is described as differing from liberal democracy in that it's a consequentialist model of political decision-making aiming to be judged by how well the government is able to improve the socio-economic lives of citizens rather than being based on democratic processes. What's your interpretation of that?
Well, I actually studied comparative politics at Yale Graduate School in the political science department. I would say each country is different. In the United States, for example, dominantly there are two-party systems. There are the Democrats versus the Republican. And people in the United States take great pride in the multiple elections that they have. However, they seldom tell you that eventually it's not the general votes that count. It's eventually the electoral votes that count. Is that right? Sometimes the candidate can win more general votes and still lose out the election to the person who wins more electoral votes. Now, in the case of the United Kingdom, they never directly elect the prime minister. Election of a prime minister is not an option at all, because the election is such that it is decided by the party which wins more votes in the parliament, and the people actually never have a chance to elect directly the prime minister. Now, whether you call this the best form of democracy or not, it's up to you to decide. And I would say the way that democracy works in the United States suits the circumstances in the United States, but it does not suit the circumstances in China. The way Britain has its own political system may be the best system for Great Britain, for the British people, but it may not work for China. What China needs to do is its own political system with its own logic and rationale, which can solve the problems facing the Chinese nation. In that sense, I think China's top priority is economic development, uplift the people out of poverty, and push for scientific and technological breakthroughs, and also build a strong national defense to prevent any possible foreign invasion of China. I would say, if you count all these major assignments that China had as a nation, China has really fulfilled all its targets over the past 4 decades and so. And this is because the Chinese people are fully enabled to exercise their own rights as citizens. They can report whatever they can think of to the people's delegates or members of CPPCC, Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference. There are multiple ways. Many people abroad think that China has only one party, the Communist Party of China. Wrong, because in addition to CPC, there are 8 other political parties, each very actively engaged in their own way, promoting democracy in China. And then the People's Congress actually plays a very important role because the delegates to the People's Congress intermingle with their constituencies. They pick up their views, sometimes grievances, for example, and report through the established channel. I have been involved in writing about many recommendations in different ways and try my best to push it through these different channels. And on many occasions, my proposals or suggestions have been accepted. Now, this is only just one personal example. I will not be surprised if many people in China do exactly what I do. We care about the country. We want to make sure that right things are done. And if we see any imperfections or problems, we raise alarm and we help the government and the party to solve the problems. I think this creates the dynamism and the momentum in the Chinese economic and political life.
This has been the Chat Lounge. Coming up next, why the misunderstanding of the Chinese political governance system? Stay with us.
The best military commander is not he who fights 100 battles and wins every one of them. The best military strategy does not lead to the desiccation of the enemy's capital city. Decoding the Art of War will help you understand why there's no art in war and how Sun Tzu stayed undefeatable using the science of war, with fun stories and insightful breakdown of famous battles. Find Decoding the Art of War wherever you listen.
Welcome back to the Chat Lounge. We continue our chat with Victor Gao, the Vice President of the Center for China and Globalization, on the development of China's domestic governance in the past 75 years. Why do you think those Western observers, they would call China's People's Congress some rubber stamp?
First of all, I think they do not understand the realities in China. Secondly, they may look at China purely from their own stereotypes.
All right.
If they see China is different from their established model, then they say, wow, China's system is not right. It cannot stand the scrutiny of time, etc. I think the better way for people in the United States or Great Britain, Germany, France, you name it, is to really understand the challenges that the Chinese nation are faced with. And then we sometimes are at different historical moments. Back in 1978, the United States was highly developed, highly industrialized. China was, relatively speaking, poor, impoverished, and backward in many ways. And China need to really catch up. And China need to learn from so many other countries. I remember when I was in middle school, I actually worked part-time in a factory making shirts for export. Now, the shirts made by that company was purely for export purposes because at that time, China did not have enough hard currency. Everyone need to work to help the country earn more hard currency. So I helped folding shirts, which eventually will be packaged properly for export. Now, China did many of these things. When I was growing up as a kid, we did not have enough cars in the country. And kids like me in my small town used to chase after whichever vehicle passing by the streets because it was such a rare spectacle. And we were so thrilled whenever we saw some vehicle passing through the street. Now, China is the largest manufacturer of automobiles, producing more than 30 million cars in 2023, and the largest exporter of EV cars. So you can see the transformation. And China succeeded in overcoming all the odds and making all the necessary transformation to make sure that by today, China's economy is the second largest if we use official exchange rate as the benchmark, and the largest by purchasing power parity. And all this cannot be done, cannot be achieved without the necessary ideological or political system to back it up.
Actually, I remember China adopted Western-style democracy in the pre-People's Republic era, right? But during that period, what the nation saw was the country was divided, actually, among former military cliques of the Beiyang army and other regional factions, and the country being invaded by Japanese militaries. So what we've experienced proved that this political system with Chinese characteristics actually is what suits China, like you just mentioned.
Well, I would say China's recent downfall started in the Opium War in 1840. And the British, defeated China in battles, forcing the export of opium to China. And the British never acknowledged that this was the kind of war they launched against China. But since 1840, all the way till 1911, when the Manchu dynasty disintegrated, for example, China suffered one defeat after another at the hands of the invading Western imperialist countries. And I think the Chinese nation were very much confused, and they were very much upset. They were really figuring out what's the best way to save China from Western countries' bullying, persecution, etc. China was carved out almost into little bits and pieces. At that time, the British controlled the Chinese customs, for example, and lots of Chinese aspiring young people went to study in Western countries or in Japan, for example. Deng Xiaoping, Zhou Enlai, Marshal Cheng Yi, Marshal Nie Rongzheng, etc. They all went abroad to study because they wanted to figure out what's the recipe that China can use to prevent foreign bullying of China, to make sure that the Chinese people can be saved and we can enjoy a better living standards. Now, you mentioned after 1911, China went from one crisis to another. And for a while, China was controlled by different warlords, which control different parts of China. And then the Japanese aggression, the occupation of China's northeastern part of China, and many other parts of China. Japan, for a while, almost controlled all the coastline in China, cutting China into bits and pieces. And I think China suffered a lot at the Western imperialist invasion and occupation to some extent, and Japanese aggression in the 1930s and 1940s. And then even after China winning the Second World War together with other allies like the United States, etc., China was still weak and controlled by Western power until Chairman Mao Zedong and the Communist Party of China drove the controlling nationalists into Taiwan, where they stayed ever since then, and liberated, in the Chinese term, the total mainland part of China. And since 1949, the People's Republic of China was established, and then China started a new pathway, that is to build up the country in economic development, in national defense, and as Mao Zedong declared, the Chinese people finally have stood up rather than being bullied or being forced to the ground by foreign occupation. And then, ever since 1978, under Deng Xiaoping, China started to focus on economic development. And I would say, for such a big country to achieve economic transformation, you need to have the institutional backup For example, what's the political system?
And going back a little bit to late 1970s, when this political reforms such as the introduction of village elections and other efforts to delegate political power were carried out, how have those reforms contributed to the governance of domestic affairs?
I would say since 1978, China's economic and political reforms started in the rural countryside. Why? Because before 1978, China practiced people's commune system. That is collective work for everyone in the countryside. They rose up in the morning together. They go to the field to cultivate the land, etc., etc. So everything was done on a collective basis. That system, while very ideal in its ambitions, didn't suit the circumstances in China. Therefore, starting in 1978, China followed what we call household responsibility system, meaning every household will become a unit in the countryside, and that household, that family, should be responsible for its own cultivation of the land, harvesting of the crops, for example, fertilizing the land, etc. And every family was enabled to function independently, rather than, for example, the whole village or the whole town, etc., doing farm work collectively in tandem with each other. Now, the family responsibility system generated huge momentum in China's rural production. You cannot believe it. The lower productivity and efficiency under the people's commune system was replaced by the dynamism and the momentum and the over-eagerness of the people to work, sometimes to overwork, because they wanted to achieve higher productivity, not only for the country, but for their own family. They want to send their kids to a better school. They want to have better living standards. Now, this reform in the countryside really transformed China. And this is, in my best judgment, one crucial area where China, since 1978, was very different from the Soviet Union throughout the 1980s till its collapse in 1991. Because in the Soviet Union, you never had such liberating force in the countryside. And when China gained huge success in the rural economic reform, and as you mentioned, practice direct elections of the village heads, for example, and enabling farmers to engage in economic agricultural production, harvesting, you name it, and eventually to sales and distribution, etc., completely on a free market basis. And then China started to have economic reform in the urban areas, meaning how to transform state-owned enterprises into market practitioners. Now, China's economy was almost up to 100% state-owned for a while, for many, many years, and now state-owned sector only accounted for less than 20%. You can see the complete transformation of China as a country, as a society, and if anyone in the West believes that China's economic development is huge, very rapid, and there is no political reform to catch up with that, that's completely wrong, because we need to change the political system to match up with the rapid, profound transformation in China's economy, both in the rural reform as well as in the urban reform. And now it's even more urgent and more important to push for complete transformation of China's science and technological development in order to deal with the challenges, for example, of the AI revolution.
Right. Like you said, those economic achievements are made under such a political system, and vice versa. The reform of the political system actually facilitated the economic transformation. And another major achievement in poverty alleviation, right? China lifted nearly 800 million people out of extreme poverty. So what's the significance of this accomplishment for domestic governance then?
I would say for so many hundreds of millions of people to be in poverty, dooms the whole country. And only by improving the living standards of the people, to enable the people everywhere in the country to enjoy a better living standards, higher longevity, for example, and higher education, better education, and eventually better nursing for the elderly, etc. Will China have a brighter future? We always say, without individual benefits and economic benefits, for example, the whole country will be hollowed out.
This has been the Chat Lounge. Coming up next, we'll check out the significance of the anti-corruption campaign to China's domestic governance. Stay with us.
Sideline Story brings you all things sports related. The hottest topics, latest events, juiciest stories, all with a very personal take. Subscribe to Sideline Story Podcast for heated sports discussions covering events that are happening in China and around the world.
Welcome back to the Chat Lounge. We continue our chat with Victor Gao, the Vice President of the Center for China and Globalization, on the development of China's domestic governance in the past 75 years. Another major achievement would be this anti-corruption campaign, right? Which obviously is important to any kind of political system. So since the first corruption execution of two high-ranking officials, Liu Qingshan and Zhang Zishan in the 1950s, Chinese authorities have never stopped cracking down on corruption, hunting both the tigers and the flies. So how vital is this anti-corruption campaign to China's political governance?
Well, first of all, I would say philosophically speaking, corruption is everywhere, in every country, every society,
Indeed,
every civilization. And for China, I think ever since 1949, when the People's Republic of China was established, China as a political system and as a government and as a political party is always committed to fight off corruption of all kinds. However, given the special nature of how power is allocated in China, there are occasions where power does corrupt, and absolute power does corrupt absolutely. This is the danger. I would say since 1949, especially under Mao Zedong, the anti-corruption disciplines were very, very harsh, very, very strict, to such an extent that corruption in China under Mao was rarely heard of. And if they were discovered, huge punishment will be dealt with immediately. And I think China as a society was relatively uncorrupt. People were very clean. Since 1978, because of the rapid economic development and because of the stronger power being concentrated in certain quarters, there were more and more occasions for corruption. And especially, for example, when China grew so fast, some of the leaders in high positions of power thought, well, if I took some benefit because we contributed to the rapid economic development, should not be a violation of party discipline or government laws, for example. They are wrong, because if they enrich themselves at the expense of the public interest, it's wrong. It's bribery, for example. Therefore, I think China has never forgotten that anti-corruption should be a top priority for the country, for the benefits of the people, and for the ruling party. I would say ever since 2012, when President Xi Jinping became the top leader in China, the anti-corruption campaign has really been intensified.
Indeed, but according to figures from China's top anti-corruption body, 110,000 officials have faced disciplinary action for corruption last year, and the numbers represent a 13% increase from 2022. And among those who faced probes were 45 senior officials. That's, quote-unquote, a record number. So people are asking, why is it so difficult to eradicate corruption? Is it a, systemic problem? Does it have to do with the design of the political system then?
Well, I would say corruption in China has Chinese characteristics. because the power is very much concentrated, and then the presumption sometimes can be made better. In China, the presumption is if you are a party secretary, if you are a governor or a mayor, you are supposed to be very clean. You are supposed to be not involved in corruption at all until you are
It's a basic
proven.
requirement.
It's a basic requirement. And sometimes failings of human beings are such that if you are tempted with so much economic interests, even if you are an angel, you fail. And sometimes the failure will be huge and mind-boggling, because the amount of the corruption is not only hundreds of millions, it's much, much more than that. And sometimes it's shocking to the people and to the nation as a whole. And sometimes officials in very high positions are found to be corrupt. But I would say the key is that if corruption cases are discovered, how to deal with that. If the country or the party or the political system have a way to go after these corrupt officials, to weed them out, to confiscate their fortunes ill-gotten, and then to strip them of power or send them to jail, for example, I would say corruptions are rampant in China. That's true.
But why?
However, the country as a whole is very much dedicated to weed out corruption as it is, and also try to figure out what's the better way to come up with institutional safeguards for China to become a cleaner country.
Or a preventative mechanism. Why isn't there such a prevention?
Indeed. For example, if we look at Singapore, Singapore's policy of anti-corruption is very simple. Civil servants are paid very handsomely so that the temptation of corruption is much more reduced. Is that right? Because you know you enjoy this high position for the benefit of the people, and you are compensated in a very handsome way. Now, in China, comparing with China and Singapore, it's very, very different. China is much larger as a country, population 1.4 billion people, and the political party, Communist Party of China, has a membership of up to about 100 million. And the differences between different parts of the country, cities versus rural areas, government positions versus corporate positions, etc., can be huge. And sometimes it is difficult to detect the problems, to report the problems. And then Chinese civil servants are, relatively speaking, paid very low compensation. There has been demand to significantly increase the compensation level for Chinese civil servants. But then, because of the huge number of Chinese civil servants involved, up to about 100 million members of the Communist Party, if you want to do the same system as the Singaporeans have, I don't think it's sustainable for China. So China needs to figure out its own way of maintaining clean government officials, and anti-corruption without any hesitation.
Then which way do you think we should take?
Now, one thing being discussed a lot in China, which has not done, and I really regret that it has not been done in a timely manner, is for government officials to report their assets. Now, in many countries, this is a must. In countries like Singapore or, for example, Japan, every civil servant need to register and disclose the assets in their family, as well as annual addition to their asset. Isn't that right? In China, there have been many attempts to do that. Up to today, it has not been enforced. And there are internal intra-party regulations to that. But I hope eventually we will have a very transparent system to make sure that if you want to be a government official, your asset will be made very transparent for the society, for the people to look at it. And then it will be easier to detect corruption cases. Now, President Xi Jinping emphasized on many occasions that if you want to become rich, don't become a civil servant. If you want to become a civil servant, devote yourself to serve the interests of the people rather than enriching yourself. All these teachings, all these warnings are very important. But when it is involving individual officials, especially officials in high positions of power, human failures sometimes may overcome or overwhelm all these very important warnings.
The mechanism is needed to retain them on the right path.
I would say anti-corruption need to be made not only on a case-by-case basis, but more and more on an institutionalized basis. That is, we need to have better checks and balances.
Right.
We need to make sure that the officials are not in a position to commit such corruption on such a large scale, rather than wait until they commit such corruption and then get them prosecuted and eventually sent to jail, because that will be causing too much damage. That will be too late.
It's also closely related to the country's legal system. And would you say the country's legal reforms a major achievement over the past 7.5 decades? You're a trained lawyer. What's your take in this regard?
I remember back in the 1980s and throughout the several decades before then, there was no lawyer as a profession. And what we call the Public Security Bureau, the People's Court system, and the prosecutor system were more or less combined together.
Right.
You have a higher level of arbitrariness because you should have enough checks and balances. You have different entities doing different things. Is that right? Police department, court system, prosecutors' offices, etc. need to do different things. In China, we more or less have an overall command system, which is good and efficient when we're looking at that. But it may also be a breeding ground for corruption or even sometimes injustice. So I think the Chinese system also need to be constantly reviewed and updated and improved whenever necessary. However, I would say in terms of the court system, for example, and the enactment of so many laws in China, in many ways, especially in commercial transaction, the Chinese legal system is very much up to international standard. After all, China is the largest economy if we use PPP as the benchmark, and the second largest one if we use official exchange rate. Is that right? And China is the largest trading nation with more than 130 nations in the world. But on the other hand, for example, in terms of how the fundamental rights of the people on an individual basis need to be fully protected, how to avoid sometimes police brutality or collusion between bad elements in the society with people inside the government, etc. We need to do a much better job.
It's about rule of law, right? It's about implementation.
So I would say due process, rule of law are very worthy ideals. And China, like many other countries, we're always on the way to make further improvements in that direction. We are not fully there at the best form of rule of law or due process, but I'm pretty sure China today, in terms of rule of law and due process, is much better than 10 years ago or 20 years ago or before 1978. Remember, in 1978, China was very much engaged in class struggle. Populations were divided into different classes, farmers, workers, or petty capitalists or big capitalists, etc.
We don't talk about it anymore.
Now it's
rule of law.
Now it's rule of law. Now each individual is equal. Man or woman, in the countryside or in urban areas, everyone enjoys the same amount of power. However, how to really protect that, that's the challenge.
Indeed.
We need to have greater transparency, greater standardization in the applying of law to each individual whenever there is a problem.
This is A Journey Through Time, a special series dedicated to the 75th anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic of China.
Like you mentioned, the Chinese government has faced many challenges from both home and abroad when governing domestic affairs over the past 7.5 decades. But what has kept people's satisfaction in the government above 85%, which, according to a long-term study by Harvard's Kennedy School of Government, reached 95% in mid-2020. What do you think has ensured the resilience of China's domestic governance?
Well, I would say the better awareness of China's progress can be felt by, I would say, overwhelming majority of the people. I always say, if I compare my own circumstance with my neighbor, I may not be the happiest person in the world.
Okay.
But if I compare myself with myself 10 years ago, 40 years ago, 50 years ago, I should be one of the happiest person in the world, especially when we compare China with many other countries where gun violence ruled, where social stability was completely in chaos, for example, where there was no economic development, where public roads and facilities are really in shambles, for example, and we can really see with our own eyes the rolling out of one of the best connectivity projects in the whole world, high-speed railway, highways, tunnels of all kinds, ports and airports, etc. These are not hidden as state secrets. These are everywhere for you to see. And then if you see the huge number of high-rising buildings in China and power generation, and I don't think any part of China really suffers from power breakout, whereas if you travel to many other countries, internet connectivity is a problem, power generation is a problem, health is a problem, and in China, if we compare China's life expectancy today with, let's say, 40 years ago, 20 years ago, huge increase in life expectancy. To such an extent, the average Chinese today, for example, in their teens and in their 20s, are much taller than their past generation. I used to be average height when I was growing up as a kid. Now I was considered very short compared with the younger generation. And this explains that the Chinese nation, in terms of their health, in terms of their level of education, in terms of their commitment to work as responsible citizens in the country, to contributing to peace and stability and development and modernization, industrialization, urbanization of the whole country is real.
So 95% of approval rating is not too shabby. Do we see, similar ratings in other countries?
I would say if there is an alien traveling from outer space to the Earth today and comparing China with many other countries, the alien would say, how? This country is really having a very solid track record. As I emphasized again and again, China maintained domestic stability, China kept peace, and China focused on economic development, focusing on emancipating people, uplifting people from poverty. Now, in China, we define human rights while similar to many other countries, but we put a premium on the right to life. Because in other countries, human lives could be easily taken away by gun violence, by many others, drug abuse, etc. And in China, we emphasize inclusive development. To such an extent, while different provinces, different regions differ significantly, in China as a whole, you have power generation, equally distributed, you have public school system, now you have college education, and it's up to 75 to 80% being admitted to college.
Right.
That's probably one of the highest rate in the world of today. And then, unless, for example, someone is violating certain red lines, for example, people live in safety and they are not in fear of their government, for example. And if there are any violations of the law, corruption in particular, every person can report the violations. And the whole society need to be further improved in maintaining a clean government, clean civil servants, and fighting corruption as much as we can to make sure people's rights will be fully protected.
That's also what we are looking forward to. Then we talk a little bit about the challenges going forward. China aims to basically realize socialist modernization by 2035, and by 2049, when we mark the centenary of the founding of the People's Republic, the Chinese government aims to build a modern socialist country that's prosperous, strong, democratic, culturally advanced, and harmonious. It seems there is no precedent to follow, right? How does such a society look like? Is it the same as what we see in any developed country today?
I think China in the future decades, especially by the middle of the century, will be a very peaceful country, dedicated to two things: maintaining domestic stability, as I mentioned again and again, and keeping peace in the world. Meaning, China will be a major force working for peace in the world, urging all countries to stop war, for example, to discontinue war. And if there is a war, China will play a very important role to urge for ceasefire and cessation of all hostilities. Now, the other thing is that China will be a major contributor to science and technology. This is exactly what President Xi Jinping and the Chinese government recently have been talking about, the new productive forces, is that right? The new qualitative productivity, meaning we want to achieve new growth and new transformation through scientific and technological breakthroughs. And this becomes especially important and urgent because AI revolution is with us already. And I would say AI will reshape and make everything we know and everything we do as an individual, as a family, as a company, as a society, as a government, as a civilization, or even as Homo sapien as a whole.
How would it make the life in the socialist, modernized society different from, the life in other society life?
Well, I would say in the Chinese system of socialism with Chinese characteristics, if we forecast to the middle of this century or earlier, 2035, the Chinese society will be more inclusive.
All right.
And the Chinese society will emphasize both on individual rights as well as societal rights as a whole. The Chinese nation will never be completely based on individualism, while we want to encourage innovation and entrepreneurship, creativity of each individual in the Chinese society. But I think there will always be a level of collectivism that needs to be emphasized. Why? Because China is so big and the Chinese population more than 1.4 billion, is that right? And then different parts of China have very, very different natural endowments. Coastal regions are much more accessible. Hinterland regions, border regions are very much landlocked, for example. So we need to have a system where everyone will not be left behind. No place, no county, no city, no border region should be left behind completely on its own. There always will be a well-functioning distribution benefits system to make sure that people in different parts of China, in different industrial sectors, for example, will all be well taken care of, rather than, for example, destined to poverty and with no helping hand, either from the central government or from people in other parts of China. And then I think China will always emphasize the importance of education, vocational training, continued education, so that the Chinese people, the Chinese nation, one generation after another, will accumulate more knowledge, more skill set, more technological know-how to make sure that China as a nation will always be more dynamic. And innovation will be the key, and pushing to the edge of scientific and technological adventures will be the key. That's why China is talking about landing Chinese persons on the moon before 2030. And I would say China probably will be the first country in this round of lunar exploration to land manned mission on the surface of the moon than any other country in the world.
Right, but you've talked about some challenges, but is there any possibility that China may miss the target with those challenges you've mentioned being, unable to be tackled or being tackled improperly?
Well, Internationally speaking, I'm very much concerned about this anti-China hostility led by the United States against China.
All right.
I think that's completely wrong. China is not an enemy of the United States, and the U.S. government should not view China as its enemy. China and the United States can get along with each other. That's why I've been advocating my own theory called inevitability of peace between China and the United States. So China and the United States need to figure out a way to get along with each other rather than getting at each other's jugular. Because if the United States want to throw China onto the ground as if there will be no consequences, that's not going to work. Domestically speaking, I think China as a country and the Chinese people as a nation need to constantly move up to the forefront of science and technology, especially when Homo sapien, mankind as a whole, is now faced with the potential threat of AI. Because if AI is not regulated, eventually it may freed up from mankind and achieve its own independence, and eventually it may subjugate human beings as the second subordinated species, whatever it means. So I think while China and many other countries need to embrace this AI revolution as wholeheartedly as we can, we need to be prepared against the evils that this AI revolution may eventually generate. And we need to make sure that Homo sapien species will not be subjugated into a second-class species in the world of tomorrow.
You said you're concerned, but are you confident, or how much confidence do you have that we can actually achieve those targets?
Well, for China to become the largest economy in the world, I think that's a mega trend. If we look at what China has achieved over the past 45 to 46 years, and based on the past experience, and we project into the future, I'm very confident that the Chinese economy, in terms of its size, will be the largest in a matter of 5 to 10 years. No more than 10 years, no later than 2035. And then by the middle of this century, the overall size of the Chinese economy will be, as Elon Musk had predicted again and again, doubling the size of the U.S. economy. That means China will play a much more important role as a major driver of economic development, as a major driver of science and technological innovation, as a major contributor to this AI revolution in the world. China, in terms of the digital economy, is already one of the leading countries in the world, and the data pool in the Chinese language led by China is becoming larger and larger. And I will not be surprised if the AI world of tomorrow for mankind will see China playing an increasingly important and indispensable role. And this benefit that China will generate is not just for China, it's for mankind as a whole. So on that basis, my projection for China tomorrow will be a very optimistic one. And China will be a major force for peace. Therefore, no country in the world should really bet that they want to have a war with China, because that will be Armageddon. We all should be working for peace between China and any other country in the world, including with the United States. And I'm very confident that between China and the United States, there will be inevitability of peace, despite of the fact that our two political systems are completely different. We have different social values, for example, and we have different history as well as futures, but we need to get along. And I think we can get along for our own benefit as well as benefit of mankind, especially when we are faced with this potential common threat from this AI revolution.
That was Victor Gao, Vice President of the Center for China and Globalization. If you have any comments or suggestions on our special series on the 75th anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic of China, let us know via radio@cgtn.com. I'm Tu Yun. Thank you for being with us. Bye for now.
Dive into news like never before with Deep Dive, the podcast from CGTN Radio. Join our global reporters for captivating stories and thought-provoking conversations. Search Deep Dive on your favorite podcast platforms and get ready to dive in.